salt and the light, and then the law. He starts talking about letters and strokes of the law. But really, I think maybe he's been talking about the law the whole time. And this whole blessed this, blessed that is just kind of his catchy intro to his sermon. See, I don't think Jesus is asking us to never get mad or lust. That's just not human. What he says makes us least is not the breaking of the commandments, but teaching that it's all right to do so. Jesus is getting at the hopes and the heart of the law versus the specifics. The law was all about living right with God by living right with your fellow humans. It's all about right relationships. But we're all human, and we all fail. None of us could ever follow all of the rules to get into heaven. I feel like Jesus is almost poking fun of the thought that we could completely follow the law, telling listeners to gouge out their eyes and cut off their hands. I read it imagining he's trying to get a little bit of a laugh. Good public speakers use humor, right? I see Jesus going to such lengths to emphasize that it is only by God's grace that any one of us ever gets into heaven, sinners that we all are. So if God is the only entity that saves anyone from hell, our proper response then is humility, not judgment. Jesus tells us the heart of the law, that even more important than your offerings, more important than your money even, is reconciliation. It's not being perfect in never doing wrong, but Jesus does ask us to be perfect in knowing that you do and will do wrong. So to live better with God, to thank God for God's continued forgiveness and undeserved love, we seek out ways to reconcile the hurts we have the courage to take responsibility for. Reconciliation. And what does that mean? It actually sounds like kind of a big deal when you think about it. Maybe even kind of hard, maybe even kind of impossible. I mean, in a broad sense, there's really so much we need to be reconciled for. It seems like an overwhelming task. So let's see what it looks like. Let's hear a story. Today I'm going to read you one by Gregory, Tolle. And it's called An Enemy Loved. As a minister, I am called to love my neighbor and to love my enemies. As a member of the human race, I find it's not always easy. A case in point is a woman in a previous congregation. I'll call her Sally to shield her identity, although it's hardly necessary. Sally has done so many unique, mean-spirited things. It would be nearly impossible not to recognize her if you knew her. It's hard to forget a 70-something squatty little bulldog of a woman with an eternal scowl on her face. Her photo in the church directory looks like she could jump out of the picture at any minute and rip your heart out. She is so angry and bitter that I'm not sure her tough exterior doesn't go to the core. I've often said you can designate a day in her honor, and Sally would find some reason to complain about it. I know these words sound harsh, but let her actions paint a picture of her for you. Not long after I met her, we were in a church meeting. I mentioned that we needed a teacher for an ongoing Bible study. A retired minister promptly volunteered. Sally, who was sitting behind him, responded loudly and belligerently she got into the car, she responded, "I hate your mother." But as my mama used to say, actions speak louder than words. It was obvious Sally hated his mother. It was obvious Sally hated everything and everybody. The son still insisted on an answer and positioned himself between Sally and the car door. Sally was now stuck. She couldn't close the door and therefore couldn't close the conversation. I don't know what Sally was thinking or if she was thinking, but she suddenly reached up and punched the 250-pound man in the nose. The man was stunned. She closed her door and drove off. It's hard to love Sally, but God said to love your enemies. So I prayed for Sally often, very often. I do my Christian duty, you know. One Sunday, though, my wife Hadley reminded me what loving an enemy really means. Hadley was sitting in worship and was compelled to say 3 important words to Sally. She went up to Sally during the passing of the peace and said, "I love you." Sally could have been more stunned if that had been a punch in the face. She murmured something like, "Oh, yeah, well, Then Hadley interrupted her, stammering, "I just thought you should know that you are loved." Quietly, Hadley walked away. It was a reminder to me that when God asks us to love our neighbors, actions speak louder than prayers. Sure, we're supposed to pray, but we're also supposed to act. We should not only tell people we love them, but also show them. Who's your enemy? Have you told them that you love them and meant it? I don't know how much of it had to do with Hadley's words, but Sally became a changed person. She offers input instead of insults in meetings now. What a testimony of God's redeeming grace that transforms us into new creations. Loving our enemies usually seems impossible. But I need to remind you that Jesus talked about big things and about little things, and that tension. And we get mixed up sometimes. Think about it, the simplicity of eating a meal with someone, and the profundity of being given the power to forgive sins and transform life. Jesus talks about both, big and little things. But we are the ones who get confused about who does what. We do the little things, and God does the big things. And when we get confused, thinking it's we, and in not fact God, responsible for the big things, well, in that confusion is where all of our sins and yuckiness rest, from pride to guilt, anxiety to idolatry. It is such a small act for one person to show mercy to another. 3 unexpected words offered sincerely in worship. A warm meal offered to a smelly stranger. A phrase, a meal. Such simple, small, little things. But let's be real too about how these even small acts are really only possible with the courage of God. And those acts only become transformative through the power of God. Even Paul